Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we are reacting to Meet Kevin's latest thoughts on Palantir. He just did a video yesterday that was about 20 minutes long, and for around 5-6 minutes he started giving some analysis and thoughts around Palantir, in particular why Cathie Wood is selling Palantir. The reason I want to react to his thoughts in particular is because Meet Kevin is someone who has pretty much analyzed every syllable that has come out of Cathie Wood's mouth since February 2020. So he has been following her like religiously. He's probably one of the only people I know in the entire world that knows exactly what she thinks on every single subject that exists when it comes to stocks, investing, the macroeconomy, etc. So Cathie Wood selling and liquidating her entire position of 30 million shares of Palantir is kind of insane, and ultimately Meet Kevin can't really come to a conclusion for why she's necessarily doing it, and if the person who's analyzed every syllable she's had over the past 2 years can't figure out why she's doing it or come to like a conclusive reason, I think that says something for how nuanced and weird the situation ultimately is. So let's get into his thoughts. We're going to analyze it, and then we're going to move forward from there and talk about why he thinks Cathie Wood is selling.
Okay, let's now talk about Palantir. So what's going on with Palantir? Obviously, Cathie Wood has almost completely sold out of Palantir at this point, including yesterday and the day before, where she sold in excess of 10 million shares per day. She's really closing out of this position here, and the question is why? What's happening here? Cathie Wood was excited about Palantir as it was diversifying away from government sources and potentially getting into other companies. But why then, as she was buying Palantir in the $20 to $30 range, would she be dumping it close to $10 to $11? And this is a big question. So
that's the fundamental question that I don't think anyone has been able to figure out yet, and I wish we can get some answers from ARK. 30 million shares in the $20 to $30 range, dumping it in the $11 range. I'm starting to believe she knows something that the world doesn't know, or, you know, like she just genuinely doesn't believe they can grow, which is kind of insane given they're one of the only companies that's in the world that's growing 30% more. They grew 41% year over year. Like most companies do not grow 41% year over year. Those are startup numbers. Those are not big technology company numbers. Palantir is starting to turn into a big technology company. So it's very confusing.
I did a little bit of digging, and it appears there's some concern that, and this is kind of like a little bit of, I would say, how should you say it, like the Achilles heel for Palantir right now. It has to do with their investments into SPAC companies as a way of generating customer growth. And this is making some individuals nervous. See, as of their current report that was published on February 17th, they only acquired 34 new customers in Q4. They did close 64 deals. 27 of those were in excess of $5 million deals, 64 were $1 million or more, and 19 were $10 million or more. So these are large contracts. But for a $21 billion company, folks are worried that if they're relying too much on too few customers, it might become difficult for them to eventually expand. Now, unfortunately, some of these new customer acquisitions came through the strategic investments of investing into SPAC deals. Now, when I actually went through their 13F filing, which shows all of the different SPACs that they've invested in, they only have about 1% of their entire market cap invested into these random sort of SPACs. So personally, I think maybe the SPAC fear is a little overblown. But just to give you an example as to why Palantir could be rotating down with some of these SPACs, remember Palantir was a direct listing, it's not a SPAC itself, but it could be because they do have $15 million that they invested into a company like AdTorrent. That is now worth $9 million because the SPAC went from $10 to $6. They have Babylon Holdings. They have $20.4 million invested in the company. Unfortunately, that stock went from $10 to $4.75.
So the point Kevin is making here is that a lot of the SPACs that they invested in when they were DPOing in 2020, probably they bought around $6 to $8. They ran up to $11, $12. Now they're down at like almost $2, $3, $4. Now, the weird part about this, and this is what Kevin mentions, that look, it's only 1% of their entire market cap in these SPACs. They're strategic investments for a purpose. I just did a video literally today. Just go to my channel and see the latest video besides this one, talking about the SPAC investments with Justin and Tom. So, like, these are strategic investments for a purpose. And the reason I bring this up is because when they're investing $15 million into a company like Adtherent, it's because Adtherent is one of the biggest data-driven advertising technologies in the world. So these aren't just, it's not a venture fund where Palantir is like, hey, we have $100 million, let's just throw it at a bunch of companies and let's hope one of them goes to the moon. It's, hey, we're going to invest in 14 very strategic companies that are using our software, which means they're paying us. So they're buying revenue from them essentially. which is able to inflate their numbers. And I understand why that may be a concern, but it's not the biggest concern if they're using your product and they're paying you for your product and you just found a way to recruit them by giving them by having an equity stake. At that point, there's a very mutually beneficial relationship and you feeling the equity stake is going to be worth something, along with them actually getting value from your product and them paying you for your product. And if they get big, they're going to keep using your product forever, right? So like instead of using Salesforce or Databricks or Snowflake, they will be using Foundry forever if they've been implemented since they were a SPAC, you know, in 2020. In 2030, they're going to be using Palantir's entire operating system for further enterprise. So the core thesis here is Cathie Wood scared that because all these SPACs have gone down, because the macro is down so much, that she wanted to liquidate her entire position because she's unsure of what's going to happen with the SPACs going forward? I think that's an insane reason to liquidate your position, but I mean, maybe that is a hypothetical reason.
They got $12.3 million in Bird Global. That stock went from $10 to $3.18. Black Sky Tech, they got $3.6 million, and that stock went from $10 to $2.2 million, or $2.2 per share, right? So we get these massive declines here in prices. Now, maybe they're up on their Boxed Inc. investment, up potentially as much as 50%, but most of these other companies they've been losing on. Now, the reason they're doing these strategic investments is their thesis is, hey, if we partner, basically venture capital partner with some of these SPACs by investing in their PIPE, which is a private investment into public equity. The theory here was, hey, if we partner with these companies, maybe they'll sign contracts with us and we'll be able to sign them on as new customers. So it's kind of a way of acquiring customers. In addition to having a sales staff, they're partnering with companies and they're like, hey, by the way, let us be essentially your Snowflake. Let us be your manager of data, so we can figure out how to streamline your logistics, streamline your sales processes, whatever. Remember, Palantir has two big divisions. They've got Gotham for their police and military use, and then of course they've got the private side for logistics and making sure they can squeeze whatever kind of conversions they can. Now, things go a lot deeper here. This video is not supposed to be delving into exactly what Palantir does. But it's a SaaS biz, software as a service. One of the downsides of the SaaS biz, though, for Palantir is they've got really high startup costs compared to some of their other competitors. Their startup costs are a lot higher because they work with a sales team to actually purposely tailor the product to their customer. And so this is
So what Kevin is saying here is that they do have some startup costs because, again, when you sign on a customer, you have to work with them kind of in the consulting phase of making sure that the Foundry product is optimized for them, which requires time and it requires money because you're not getting any money from them. You're paying money to these engineers to optimize the product for these clients. Until they close the deals, they don't really make the profit off of that. But when they do, they have about 80% gross margins, which is, amazing for a SaaS business.
When we zoom into some of their growth figures, hey, look, yeah, the top line growth figure shows a 34% year-over-year growth rate, which is great. But remember, in order to reach their 2025 targets, they need to have an annualized growth rate, as Alex Karp tells us of, in excess of 30%, which they still say on their filings they're trying to get to an excess of 30% growth. But the problem here is the following. Yeah, they hit 34% growth now, but if you take out the SPAC revenue, their growth was 26%, which sounds nominal, but if you need to hit that compounded 30, coming in at 26, because of the decline in SPACs and seeing SPACs get absolutely obliterated on the market, leaving questions as to how long we could keep relying on this sort of SPAC-based growth, it's no surprise that Palantir is falling a little bit. Now, does that make me overall concerned for Palantir? Well, look, I'm overall concerned for virtually all stocks right now, so don't look at what I'm doing with my money. But let me just put it this way. I'm looking at Palantir as a potential investment. I'm not invested in Palantir. I'm not short Palantir, but I like what Palantir does. So that's why I've been studying Palantir.
That's really interesting to think about. I actually wanted to bring that up in this video. I have always thought of Kevin as a pretty smart guy. I mean, you can say whatever you want about Kevin. At the end of the day, to get 2 million people to subscribe to you, the amount of hustle he puts in, the amount of content he puts out, do I agree with everything? No. But, that's just my opinion at the end of the day. I think it is objectively... You cannot objectively say this guy does not work hard, this guy does not do a ton of research, and this guy does not give his all when it comes to bringing, hopefully, the most valuable content on YouTube in regards to stocks, investing, and finance for as many people that would like to consume deep research-driven pieces of content, with a hint of entertainment as well. As a result of that, I think if you're that smart of a person, you start to easily recognize the value proposition of Palantir, right? He was an early investor in Tesla in 2020. Even when Tesla was falling, he saw the value of it. Now, maybe it was a hype stock, maybe he got on it, whatever. But like, nonetheless, you made the investment and you made some millions of dollars off of it. I think if you're that smart, you probably realize what the value prop of Palantir is if they can get that execution of the growth rate. Because the product and the concept of the product being the modern operating system for the enterprise, that's a really interesting value proposition to someone who understands business, to someone who understands SaaS, and to someone who understands what it means for a product to scale, which I think Kevin does understand. So at that point, it's interesting to say that he's doing a lot of research on Palantir because he's thinking of making an investment into Palantir. Because that if he makes an investment into Palantir, then that means it is a world in which he starts to feel this company has really, really strong growth potentials. So obviously, I've always thought of Kevin as a smart person. So I always wondered in the back of my head, why isn't he invested in Palantir? Like, it seems so obvious to me. So it makes sense that now at these prices, becoming absolute dirt cheap, in my opinion, it's starting to become more attractive.
And I really want to understand some more clarity as to where they're really getting their customers outside of the government. Because we have seen a little bit of a slowdown in the amount of contracts they're getting from the government. In fact, we have seen some contraction in the government sector. We've also seen a lot of their revenues concentrated in a handful of larger commercial customers. This is why these SPAC deals are bringing a lot of questions, because we're still concentrated. We still haven't spread away. And really, to get this stock to trade higher, we need to beat this 30% growth. And so I think that's why we're seeing some of this concern. It's really the weight of that SPAC problem here. Now, they are going to spend more money on their sales force. In fact, they expect to hire 200 more sales professionals as soon as possible. And what I thought was interesting is in their earnings calls, they talk about how they're not actually just trying to hire salespeople. They're trying to hire engineers and professionals that can actually understand the product and then sell it, which personally I support. I think if you are selling a product, you need to understand the product inside and out, and then selling the product becomes second nature. That's why when I became a real estate agent, the first thing I did was, okay, I got to buy a house. I got to know the product. I got to know the process myself, Anyway, we do have a big boost, though, in contribution margin. This would be like their revenue minus their variable costs. And basically, you want your revenue minus variable costs to be really, really high, because that means your sales dollars are more effective. So the commissions you're paying are more effective at bringing in more top line. And we are killing it compared to what we were doing pre-COVID. So Palantir has had a huge boost, really, since their IPO. Not sure how much COVID was involved, but since their IPO, really, really huge boost. Now, why is Cathie potentially selling?
So before we finish off with the Cathie stuff, the contribution margin is increasing and making sure those sales dollars are more effective, meaning when you sell a product for $10,000 and you get $1,000, like a 10% commission on that, making sure when you're spending that $1,000, giving that commission, that's coming out of the revenue of what you're generating from that $10,000. So that's worth $9,000. So the $9,000 you get as a net profit or net revenue of the product you've sold minus the sales commission revenue minus all your variable costs. So let's say maybe there's $6,000 of variable costs. Then you have that $3,000, 9 minus 6 of contribution margin. Those $3,000 is what goes into the bottom line, and all the finance people in Palantir have to calculate to be able to show on investor presentations day, right? It's those $3,000 that matter. If that $3,000 becomes $500 because the variable costs are so high that the contribution margin gets lower, then they're not really becoming profitable. They're not really growing at the rate that they need to be growing, or they're growing, but the sales dollars are being so excessively used that their margins, which need to be at an adjusted operating margin of around 35% with the growth rate that they're having about 30%, in order to truly get the stock price to appreciate, it just won't happen at that point, right? So those contribution margins are very, very crucial to happen.
This is the big question. Some folks are somewhat confused here, and they argue that Cathie Wood has this sort of halo effect, where when Cathie Wood buys something, she pumps it up, like Palantir, $20 to $30. Now when she's selling, she's actually dragging it down. Of course, a lot of folks are now joking that, okay, well, now that Cathie's out, we can finally go to the moon on Palantir. But people are still now speculating, why would she sell Palantir to buy things like Roku? And I have to agree, I thought this was kind of interesting, because when I read the Roku earnings call, All I heard were wages are going up, which is their number one factor in OPEX. Their component prices across the board are still creating significant issues for them. And while some prices have come down, they expect prices to remain significantly elevated. They say that that TVs are a very low margin business, and they're
all right. I'm going to stop it there, and then he goes on to say that Roku's kind of crazy for saying that TVs are a low margin business, and then they're building their own TVs as well. I'll do some more future videos because I want to try to analyze Roku and why Cathie is making that decision as well. But those are his overall thoughts on Palantir. And again, he concludes by saying, I have no idea why she's selling outside of buying Roku. And then he tries to analyze why she's buying Roku. And the obvious, impact is that Roku has a better rate of return over Palantir. So she wants to dump all that money into Roku. She may be very well right on that. But if she's wrong and Palantir starts growing 40-45% and Roku's stuck in the gutter, then she's going to take a massive $380 million loss on this position because of her lack of conviction on Palantir. So those are my overall thoughts. Those are Kevin's thoughts. Hope you guys enjoyed this analysis. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on what you think on what Kevin said and ultimately why you think Cathie Wood has been selling Palantir. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.